We are trapped in history. History is trapped in us, said James Baldwin. When Mary sent me the draft for the service, I was struck by the word trapped in the quote in this order of service. History being trapped in us. Is that a forever state, or can we free it? I'm from Elk River, Minnesota. It's a city now, but when I was growing up, it was a small town of about 2,000 people, and I always felt like I was related to about half of them. My paternal grandparents, who were born in Hungary, came over as young children, and their families eventually settled in Minnesota, as did my mother's grandparents, who came over from Germany. They were all farmers. One of my favorite memories is going out into the woods where my grandparents, my paternal grandparents, first had a little house. We loved digging in the ground and finding the things that had been discarded and left behind when they had dragged the house from that spot out closer to the main county road. We loved living in the country where there was plenty of room to roam, where there was a hollow where we could play baseball with cousins and neighbors, where there was 80 acres of land where we would have hay rides with our youth group. When I was in high school, my parents bought a small cabin on Mille Lacs Lake, about an hour north of Elk River. We loved to go to the cabin and swim and fish. I learned to water ski. Also around the same lake is the Mille Lacs Indian Reservation, the land of the Ojibwe tribe. I knew little about what a reservation was, or the history of the Ojibwe people, or any Native community. I only know that we would sometimes stop at the museum when we were on vacation, and we'd buy little souvenirs at the store. In 1992, when I was in Nicaragua, I made a retreat with other North Americans and European folks who were living and working in the country. We had gathered to study together some materials that had been published to mark the 500 years since Columbus landed in what he called the New World. Being in Nicaragua, we were compelled to study and read and talk about what had happened and continues to happen to the people, not only of Nicaragua, but in the many lands throughout South America, Mexico, and North America. The Contra War, financed by the U.S., had recently ended when Violeta Chamorro, a Democratic president supported by the U.S., was elected in Nicaragua. Knowing this drove our desire to understand the history. We were working with the people ravaged by the Contra War that was waged by the United States and its allies, professing to be fighting for democracy, which we quickly learned meant that transnational companies could come in freely to establish sweatshops, to ravish the forests, to send the wood north, to forcibly take lands from the peasants, and so many more atrocities. The exploit of history was centuries old and current. It was at this retreat that I had a profound recognition of who I was, of what part of history I was directly related to. My grandparents and great-grandparents and their descendants were farmers and laborers who worked hard and had many struggles. Good people who went to church and who cared for and about their neighbors. Here I was with my Franciscan community and all these others on retreat who were there to support the Nicaraguan people in their struggle to reclaim the lands taken from them by Somoza and his allies. And here I am, reading about the people who were forcibly removed from the very lands my family farmed and vacationed on. As we were reading and discussing, all of a sudden, I felt this visceral sense of wanting to strip myself, to tear my garments and put on sackcloth and ashes. I had never used or thought of those words before, but they were in my mind like a command from my depths at the moment of a painful recognition of who I was as a descendant of European settlers. I was curious of the context of these words as they so described what I felt in that moment. In looking them up, I learned that for the Hebrew people, the tearing of garments was a way of expressing great grief and sorrow. Sackcloth and ashes were put on to show distress, humility, desperation, and protest. Such was Mordecai's distress when he learned of the plan to annihilate the Jews. In the book of Esther, chapter 4, it reads, "When Mordecai perceived all that was done, he rent his clothes and put on sackcloth with ashes, and went out into the midst of the city and cried with a loud, bitter cry." I don't remember if I cried, but there was a loud and deep cry inside that feels as piercing today as it did then. I can't unsee or unacknowledge what I know now. Is history trapped by ignorance and an unwillingness to understand painful realities and our place in them? Is it freed when we acknowledge that we live with structural and economic inequities and accept responsibility for the present and future as well as for the past? To free trapped history and to do the work of healing and reparation, I first must acknowledge the wrongdoing and do the work of repair. I need to keep reading and listening, for the wrongdoings are over centuries and being done yet today. And it is still close to home. Land that belongs to the Native American people in Minnesota and many other places is still being disputed in the courts. My niece, who is married to an Ojibwe man, has a daughter who is harassed in school because her skin is darker than her classmates. The repairs are extensive and ongoing. It is not someone else's responsibility. It is mine. It is ours. And as we will hear in our reading today, we can never declare that the work is over.